Um, Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, and to everybody at the National Safeguarding Office. I really welcome the opportunity, and I'm honoured and grateful to be allowed to give this keynote talk alongside people like Sean and Adam and your good selves. For me, it's really important that we're all in the room together. We've spent 3 years attending webinars, meeting with each other visually, but there's nothing like just the embodied experience of being in a room and actually having proper dialogue. So I come here as a practitioner, not an academic. I've worked in services for people with intellectual disabilities, many of whom are autistic and have been late diagnosed, some of whom have gone on to develop cognitive decline associated with ageing and dementia. I'm employed by the Marisa Foundation, previously known as the Sisters of Charity of Jesus and Mary Services, so no prizes for guessing that we emanated from the religious orders. We're a Section 38 voluntary body funded directly by the HSE. We provide health and clinical and social care supports to children and adults with intellectual disabilities and autism across 7 counties in the Midlands. Over recent years, and in line with national policy, we have completed the decongregation of 2 large campus-based residential institutions, and we replaced these institutions with a variety of residential supports matched to needs, meet the needs of each person. And we developed a range of models, including single occupancy services for those people with exceptional needs, self-directed and family-directed services, small group homes, and a range of radically person-centred support arrangements. And those were developed with an emphasis on enabling people to live with disabilities to live lives of their choosing in their natural community, with socially valued roles, community connectedness, and a sense of purpose or meaning, or so we thought. We've learned that the people that we support live in community settings, but we're increasingly aware that being situated in a community doesn't necessarily confer all the benefits of being part of or belonging to a community. So it's an ongoing challenge for us all working in social care systems to empower people to make decisions and to take informed risks. And today it's an opportunity to share some thoughts on the difficulties, but also the possibilities of this work, and the stakes have never been higher. I don't think I need to remind this audience of the rapidly evolving area that is working in the Irish context in safeguarding. We have the HSE Adult Safeguarding Vulnerable Adults policy and related policy and regulatory advances, including the Health Act and the development of HICWA inspection standards for residential settings. We have further advances around human rights, the ratification of UNCRPD, and the imminent enactment of the Assisted Decision-Making Act. One might think that there is a policy and legal infrastructure to support the work, maybe not at the level that we would see as appropriate, but at an implementation level, I don't think anyone would disagree that there is a significant shortfall and a gaping black hole in terms of resourcing that we have to contend with every day. And never more so than now. Really, we're in the midst of a post-pandemic recruitment and retention crisis. So while the existence of policy, legislation, statutory regulation might lead us to assume that there's sufficient accountability in place to assure that adults at risk are at the very minimum in safe hands, it's really hard to prove that this is the case, and there's such a level of complexity at play. And fundamentally, there's an inherent tension between supporting the human rights of adults and our responsibility to protect adults from harm. So my ambition in this talk is to initiate a broad discussion about how health and social care services can balance these responsibilities to safeguard adults at risk from abuse while upholding every citizen's right to self-determination, autonomy, and positive risk-taking. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk to 4 questions. Firstly, where are we at now as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic? Secondly, what does the research, and in particular the psychological research, tell us about human decision making, especially in relation to risk? Thirdly, what organisational supports are required to promote risk enablement, which is another word for positive risk taking? And finally, how can we collect and share human stories of lived experience of disability and examples of good practice? And then I'm going to conclude with just some unified themes and a call for action. So, where are we now? People have already touched on the fact that we've had a really difficult 3 years. In 2021, Tom Shakespeare et al. Wrote an article in The Lancet, and they talked about while the COVID pandemic was affecting everybody, that people with disabilities were differentially affected in 3 ways. Increased risk of poor outcomes from the disease itself, reduced access to routine healthcare and rehabilitation, and the adverse social impacts of efforts to mitigate the pandemic. And that's really clear to us now, especially in disability services. Maybe different to some nursing home standards, we certainly managed to keep people safe, but at significant cost. So for a substantial period of time, people were contained in their group homes. They had very little access to the outside world. There were blanket restrictions, very little access to families or external advocates. People gained weight, people ate an awful lot, people became unhappy, and people lost confidence. And in a sense, for the last 20 years, we've worked really hard to develop a human rights agenda in disability services and help people to escape from traditional services and lead independent lives. Almost overnight in March 2020, that evaporated. So we're starting from a different base. Okay, in June 2020, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission spoke to the Oireachtas Special Committee on the COVID-19 response. And they spoke about how people with disabilities have been treated in this country is one that chronicles abuse, neglect, stigma and inequality. In recent times, positive gains have been made to move away from this past, culminating in Ireland's ratification of UNCRPD. We have made some progress in the move from the old charitable medical model of support for people with disabilities towards a more holistic, rights-based perspective, supporting people to live inclusive and independent lives. And then they went on to hazard a caution. We risk losing much of this progress if we fail to address the human rights and discrimination risks to build a transition out of COVID-19 that is fully inclusive of people with disabilities. Positive measures must be taken across a range of areas to ensure that all groups of people with disabilities transition out of the emergency phase on an equal basis with each other and the rest of the population. The alternative risks a permanent erosion of the human rights and equality of people with disabilities. And this is just really evident right now. While many of us struggled with compliance with blanket rules and restrictions, to some extent, there are some people in service land where it actually felt really comfortable because everything was rule governed. We drifted overnight back into a medical model. We sat every evening and listened to our chief medical officer tell us what we were allowed and not allowed to do. Uncertainty was gone. We knew if we just followed the rules, we'd all be kept safe. And we're kind of still stuck there a little bit in disability world. Okay, Doody and Keenan in 2021 published a study on the reported effects of the pandemic on people with intellectual disabilities and their carers in Ireland. They concluded, this review highlights the psychological and social consequences of the pandemic for people with intellectual disability who've stopped participating in their communities and have had their routines interrupted during lockdown and restrictions for a prolonged period, and access to education, health, vocation and mental health services disrupted. In addition, many have found it difficult to understand COVID-19 and to self-regulate their behaviour, creating a risk of behaviours that challenge, which negatively affect the emotional well-being and quality of life of the person. They went on to say that one could argue further segregation is occurring, not just by wider society or generic health services, but also in terms of service provision that intensifies this sense of isolation. Therefore, services and society need to strike a balance between humanity and restrictions. Okay, so where are we now? As we emerge from the pandemic, we have lost hard-won and really substantial ground in our efforts to uphold the human rights of adults with disabilities, to be valued and respected as equal citizens. In many instances, and with absolutely extraordinary sacrifices by the adults we support, direct support staff and family carers, we've managed to save lives, but at such a significant cost. So it's now timely to take a renewed focus on supporting people to lead lives that are worth living. So we need to provide hope for a better future, and this is where risk-taking has a role. So I'm going to move on to my second question. What does the research tell us about human decision-making in relation to risk? And I think just to set the scene, a lot of when we talk about risk, and I think Sean's already alluded to it, comes from sort of static health and safety risk assessments when we're talking about identifying hazards and mitigating the impact of hazards. Humans are much more complicated. Psychologists have been studying the art of decision-making for centuries. And the conclusion from much of this work is that people are generally pretty bad at making good or at least rational decisions when faced with risk. We're pretty terrible at calculating the actual probability of specific outcomes. We've a tendency to focus on the wrong factors. We're susceptible to a wide variety of decision-making biases that too often lead us astray. People in the real world tend to see risk as something in which we are unsure of the consequences of our behaviour, in which the end result of a particular action is something we can't know. And to some extent, risk is in the eye of the beholder. How you perceive risk is dependent on your experiences, your values, whether or not you crave an adrenaline rush. While many of us fear risk, we applaud successful risk takers. We pay homage to heroes, rule breakers, and thrill seekers. The slide that I'm showing is of a guy called Alex Honnold, and some of you may have heard of him. He's probably the most famous rock climber in the world. He practices a form of rock climbing called free soloing, which means that he climbs on his own and without any safety ropes. And in June 2017, he became the first person to free solo the terrifying 3,000-foot rock face at El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. So, people have strong views on this. Is he a successful risk taker? Should we applaud him? Or is he a reckless thrill seeker with a disregard for life? So I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. Scientists don't agree on a strict definition of risk or risk taking. Our vernacular is peppered with cliches relevant to risk. We talk about high risk, high reward, no pain, no gain. He who dares wins. Throw caution to the wind. We talk about risk in really contradictory extremes. Risk is bad, it can lead to danger or death. Oh, hold on there, risk is good, it can lead to glory and happiness. So which is it? How can we make sense of these contradictions so that we can make better decisions about managing life or managing risk in our own lives? Risk is simply a decision that has a significant probability of resulting in a positive or a negative outcome. So that's quite simple. As people have already stated, risk is part of every single decision that we make every single day. Risk is neither good nor bad. Risk is necessary. Risk offers us potential, the kind of potential that helps us grow, explore, and respond to the world. Successful risk-taking is simply about being willing to explore alternatives. By taking some risks, we learn how to cope with better decisions. Risk-taking is enriching. Fundamentally, risk offers us hope. What about risk when we're working with adults deemed to be at risk? Professionals working in health and social care need to navigate competing concerns about risk, including difficult balances between protection, risks, and what we now call positive risk-taking. This involves complex decision making, which we already know we're not particularly good at, but often in situations of stress and in cultures where there's potential blame, and in contexts where perceptions of risk by the people that we support may differ widely from those of their families, their direct support staff, or professionals. So the increased focus on risk in social care has an impact on all levels of decision making. Colloquially and in social care services, risk is often conflated with danger. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit controversial. I mean, we talked about closing institutions and moving people into homes of their own in community settings. And sometimes we think we've done a great job and patted ourselves on the back. But unfortunately, sometimes these settings can be just as institutionalised. Alex Fox in 2018 wrote a book about escaping the invisible asylum. And I think it resonates with some of Sean's talks about care homes. Alex Fox talks about one of the signs that you're living in an invisible asylum is that you're in a place of safety, as defined by others who have a professional but not a personal responsibility for keeping you safe. The availability of this type of support is a good thing, but never unproblematically benign. It is support which at times keeps people safe from death, but at other times safe from life. And losing the freedom to take risks entails losing one's full citizenship. Risk has played and continues to play an important role in shaping policies and services for adults with disabilities. People with disabilities are generally regarded as being at risk. Research highlights that there are very real risks to them in terms of poor treatment by others, lack of available opportunities, and poor physical and mental and social well-being, which I hazard to say can be actually exacerbated by full-time residential care. While the at-risk discourse might be helpful in highlighting the need for action and making the case for different kinds of responses, it can be problematic too. As you are no doubt aware, language can be very disempowering, and being deemed vulnerable or at risk can immediately neglect equality issues and merely entrench discourses of paternalism and care. In other words, being at risk can in itself be construed as a risk factor. Being part of an at-risk group can lead to a protection discourse, and where protection can easily lead to acts of over-protection. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about risk aversion, or the risk of no risk. One of the key consequences of the risk and protection discourse is that services designed for people can adopt quite risk-averse policies in response to the identified risks that are often more perceived than real, and this is known as risk aversion. It's been written about since the 1970s. Persky wrote about the dignity of risk and argued that many staff in disability services tended to be overzealous in their attempts to protect. In 2002, Aleziewski found that although services recognised the importance of risk management, policies were based on a restricted approach that emphasised hazard assessments and health and safety issues. So staff teams can focus more on risk assessment and avoidance of risk than making social inclusion happen. Accessing new life experiences involves risk. People with disabilities want to take risks, but professionals and support staff can often be afraid to do so. Why? Again, Sean has already alluded to blame culture. So risk aversion is generally driven by a fear of getting things wrong, or of inadvertently causing harm, or by faulty assumptions and preconceptions about the ability of people with disabilities to cope in what might be seen as risky situations. But we need to keep remembering that experiencing the risk-taking of ordinary life is necessary for normal human growth and development. Research has shown that adults with disabilities from more risk-tolerant families tend to be given more autonomy. Adults from less risk-tolerant families are more likely to be overprotected. In interviews with 35 people with intellectual disabilities in 2005, a study found that people with disabilities, their families and professional staff did not have any shared understanding of the desired degree of dependence or independence of the individual, which resulted in disagreements about support goals. And a particular area of concern for everybody was exposure to risks. So to promote the move away from a protection-dominated discourse, it can be argued that the more detailed description and conceptualization of positive risk-taking is required. And we also need to understand what conditions are required for these cultures and practices to develop. We're often faced with the challenge of making demanding decisions about risk while working in really stressful environments with the added pressure of limited resources and more recently, really intense media and political scrutiny. And this just contributes to risk-averse cultures in which services become more concerned with managing reputational risk than promoting risk enablement. When a service manages or avoids a risk that they perceive in a person's life, too often they ignore a whole set of risks inherent in that intervention. Because there's a risk inherent in every human intervention or interaction. Risk is as necessary as oxygen. Organisations that are risk-averse are in fact blasé about the risks that matter most to people. And these are the risks of loneliness, dependence, and a lack of freedom or autonomy. It's only the risks that matter more to organisations to which they are averse. If we're not helping people to understand and take risks, we're preventing them from living. So risk aversion depletes a hope for a better future. What about when things go wrong? Well, we're all operating in a climate of significant resource constraints. We've all much more to do and less to do it with. So it's really important that we create the structures and cultures and practices that ensure we do the right thing with the limited resources that we have. As Sean said, inevitably things will go wrong. They always do. In recent years, the results of many inquiries is to foster a blame culture. This can be exacerbated by politicians and the media, especially social media, where people are baying for blood. It must be somebody's fault. In environments where blame is individualised and society seeks scapegoats when errors and wrong decisions are made, practitioners are just going to develop defensive practices which don't lead to improvements in services. Given the stressful nature of the work, human service organisations typically have cultures of stress. And what we do in cultures of stress is we attempt to reduce uncertainty with the application of lots of rules and procedures that regulate behaviour. By over-regulating and having too much policy and procedure, we strangle professional creativity and decision-making autonomy. And we just end up in a culture of compliance. Managers focus on meeting regulatory standards at the expense of positive risk-taking. Organisations foster a top-down blame culture. Staff have to achieve the required performance for fear of consequences if they fall short, especially with the emergence of the name and shame game. Very quickly, managers and staff evaporate goodwill because there are energy dips and they question the purpose of their roles. People burn out. We have a retention and recruitment crisis. I'd like to suggest that the emphasis on documentation, hard data and audit, prioritised over time spent working directly in relationship with adults, can lead to dangerous practices both organisationally and professionally. Leadership is about developing skills and behaviours and having the ability to connect with people both at a head level but also at heart level. Disempowered workers are at best unlikely to be able to empower adults, and at worst are likely to disempower them further. Empowered workers who believe in their ability to make a difference in their own lives as well as in the lives of others are much more likely to pass on those skills to those that they support. Okay, so my third question. So what kind of organisational supports are required to promote risk enablement, which is the same as positive risk-taking? One is a culture of shared responsibility. Even great services create harm. Even safeguarding can create harm. Many of the people that lived in the institutional settings that we've been successful in closing down were sent there to keep them safe. They were plucked from their communities because in one of the settings where I work, because many of them were living in family farms around the country, developed epilepsy, and in the 1950s in Ireland, epilepsy was really stigmatising, and people were sent away because of shame. Unless we look, acknowledge and measure harm, we're not going to be able to agree in advance about how to manage it. Organisations need an approach to when things go wrong, because they are going to go wrong. And we need to agree this in advance between staff, individuals and their families. This needs to include a frank discussion about what kind of risks a person wants to take, the support they need to do so, and how responsibility will be shared when things go wrong. So this is a shift in culture from blame to a culture of shared responsibility, and which is really accountability. Research indicates that in order to become a more successful risk taker, you actually have to work at it. You have to develop self-awareness about your own perceptions and responses to risk as you make decisions. The successful risk taker is thoughtful and prepared. The successful risk taker is taking risks that help him move towards a long-term goal, as opposed to the dysfunctional or impulsive risk taker who's only looking at short-term outcomes. Successful risk takers are actually planners by nature. They consider all factors. They visualize success. They focus on the big picture. They take their time, prepare, and only take risks that lead them towards a long-term goal that matters to them. That's what helps ensure that they succeed more than they fail. You see, risk-taking is inordinately influenced by how familiar we are with the activity at hand, coupled with deliberate practice. Stress and emotions alter how we consider risk. Not enough stress leads to a lack of motivation to take risks. Too much stress can skew risk calculation. So successful risk takers learn to self-regulate stress and emotions to lead to better decision making. And teams need to do the same, as do organisations. So back to Alex Honnold. In 2019, his scale of El Capitan in Yosemite Park was filmed for a documentary called Free Solo, and went on to win, I think, 7 Oscars. There was a bit of a backlash at the time. It was felt, gosh, he's going to encourage other people to take these crazy risks. But when you listen to interviews of Alex Honnold, he's a fascinating guy from every perspective. He talks about how he spent 25 years full-time practicing climbing. He spent 7 years preparing for this climb, including 3 months per year at Yosemite with daily practice, 40 hours per week of training. He said that preparation is what stops the fear. He memorized every hand and foothold of the 3,000-foot climb. He used self-awareness and self-regulation to measure fear responses. There's a really interesting part of the documentary where scientists ask him to go into an fMRI scanner, and they look at how his amygdala responses, so his threat system responses when shown fearful pictures. And basically it didn't respond, and people were going, oh my gosh, this guy's neurology is different. And he would say, no, it's the opposite. I was in a scanner, I was perfectly safe, I wasn't on a cliff edge, I wasn't going to die, of course I wasn't scared. He talks about how visualization, trust, creativity and planning are all important around risk-taking. He talks about how every individual has a responsibility to make the world a slightly better place than they found it. So, mistakes are actually opportunities for learning, and successful risk takers are motivated by failure. It tells us that we're not done preparing yet. It's an inspiration to work harder, train better, learn more. Like, optimal risk-taking doesn't have to be about thrill-seeking or exotic adventures. It's about exploring, adapting, focusing, and making predictions about future experiences. So therefore, risk-taking is a critical part of being alive. It's about keeping your brain sharp and being prepared to deal with whatever life throws at you. It's about challenging yourself a bit so that you can accrue wisdom and help your brain become a better prediction machine. What about organisational supports? The published research highlights the fact that current approaches to regulation and inspection of service settings tends to focus on the completion of paperwork and documentation rather than on people's lived experiences. This results in processes and bureaucracy dominating service provision, which can restrict the opportunities that staff, managers and professionals have to build relationships with people and their families, because it's only through relationships that we discover what really matters to people. And this has been massively exacerbated in the last few years through the pandemic. In fact, overly bureaucratic systems and procedures can strangle creative practice and completely disempower people. So it's really important that we don't replace humanity and relationships with procedures and processes. Strengths-based approaches to successful risk-taking requires leaders to trust in the professional judgment of the team. And a key part of this is to invest lots of time in getting to know team members, their personalities, how they work, the provision of reflective supervision. Research shows that people are more able to deal effectively with challenges when they're given permission to fail, and where failure is actually deemed by their organisation as an opportunity for learning and not for blame. So, the use of values-led, rights-based, and truly, rather than person-centred, person-led social work practice should include conversations with individuals and their families about what matters most to them and how their personal histories might influence decision-making. I'm going to skip on just a little bit. So, my final question. How can we collect and share human stories of lived experience of disability and examples of good practice? And I like to think that days like today are a starting point, but I think we need lots more of it. So, in looking at some examples of good practice, I'm just going to talk about a few. There was a study in the UK, which might have been what Sean was talking about with the donkey in the care home. It was a study that was carried out in Wales, Andrews et al. And it was a study of risk enablement in care homes for people with dementia. And the point of the study was to support staff in positive risk-taking. And their aim was to create experiences that produced that tear of joy, the passing smile, the kind word, a tiny act, a bold statement, or a big achievement or rekindled wish. They wanted the experiences to connect the individuals they were supporting with their past or with people in their lives. And these ranged from bringing animals like lambs and donkeys into the home, taking people to football matches, reenacting the wedding of one of the staff, creating a beach in the care home garden. They all seem really basic, but they don't happen as a matter of course when somebody goes into full-time residential care. And in all of these examples, the consistent message was that somebody had to take a risk in order for the magic moment to emerge. This is another example from the UK. It's called Stay Up Late UK. Heavy Load is the name of a punk band with 5 disabled and non-disabled members. And there's a film made about the band from 2008. And it shows the difficulties associated with being a punk who has a learning disability. In one scene, one of the band members expresses his wish to move to a city because he wants to live a more rock and roll lifestyle. But the professionals involved in his care overrule this decision because they believe he might be unsupported or at risk. And from this band and film has emerged a UK charity called Stay Up Late. And it's a really simple premise. In typical service land, late nights out to social events, including concerts and gigs and festivals where there might be alcohol, can be seen as risky. Or we don't have enough staff support, or we might miss handover time. Even though the person supported might be more concerned about the risk of losing out. So this charity came up with a solution called Gig Buddies, a scheme where disabled and non-disabled people are matched around shared taste in music and attend gigs together. So really simple. I'm sure you're all aware of Make Safeguarding Personal. I know that, was it 3 years ago, you had Professor Michael Preston-Shute as a guest speaker talking about this UK initiative, which aims to develop a person-centred and outcomes-focused approach to safeguarding work. Because it's not just about doing the safeguarding, it's, well, what did the safeguarding achieve? Was it good? But was it bad? Nothing is benign. The focus is placed on the outcomes people want and understanding what makes for well-being in their lives, not in the lives of the professionals who are worried about risk. So it moves away from an organisational perspective on risk management to working with people to achieve the right balance between safety and well-being. In other words, how can we support individuals to take informed risks? I'm going to be a bit preemptive now and just talk about a project that we're planning in our own service. In November 2020, Minister Anne Rabbitte with the Department of Health and the HSE invited applications for once-off funding with 3 possible strands. And we were in the midst of the COVID pandemic and feeling pretty useless and despairing at, I suppose, the fact that overnight we had regressed into a model where everybody was sort of locked at home in their group homes with little access to the world. And we were wondering, how are we ever going to get back to the place we were pre-March 2020? So we successfully wrote a proposal for a project that will have 2 strands. And one of them is a systems-wide leadership programme. And that's designed to influence mindset and promote organisational culture change so that we get back on track about supporting and empowering people to live lives worth living. We've started the rollout of that with 130 leaders across our services with the support of an external coaching psychologist. And then the second strand of the project involves investing in our greatest resource. We've a workforce of 1,300 staff. And it struck us that, mandatory trainings when you come into disability work are safeguarding, complaints, manual handling, but we don't talk about relationship. We don't talk about positive risk-taking. We don't talk about culture of autism. We don't talk about the transactional model of stress. So we're going to develop and run a 2-day experiential training that focuses on these important values, the importance of relationship, an introduction to the neurodiversity paradigm, and an emphasis on developing staff self-awareness of relational responding. And we're hoping that the project will help us move in this transition from a risk-averse culture of paternalism to help the staff that support individuals to work more collaboratively with people and empower them to live lives worth living. So watch this space. I'm just going to refer to a few case studies, again from the work, and there's some parallels with what Sean has already spoken to. Under AGM, one of the principles is respecting the right to make unwise decisions. And it reminded me of a case that we experienced, even the word case, a lady that has lived in institutional care for much of her adult life. She was living happily on a farm down in the west of Ireland. In her 20s, experienced a seizure, was diagnosed with epilepsy, and before she knew it, she was shipped off to an institution in the Midlands. She was pretty unhappy, and she was deemed to be a difficult person, who are often the freedom fighters, the people who aren't happy in service land. But in recent years, with the closure of the residential setting, she'd moved to live in a cottage, which was really kind of a group home, but she had a really lovely bedroom, she had really nice staff. There were male staff, and this just made it for her. She loved the chats. She, on file, has a diagnosis of mild intellectual disability. You'd have to query if she hadn't been institutionalised in her 20s, would she have that diagnosis? She started having recurring chest infections. She's in her 80s. She was hospitalised with pneumonia. And suddenly there was a flurry of concern. Apparently, while in hospital, concerns were expressed about the potential of aspiration. And a speech and language therapist was asked to assess this lady. And the way it was described to me is that she ran the speech and language therapist from the ward. She was discharged home. A modified diet was recommended just in case, and she said under no circumstances was she going to cooperate with it. She refused a video fluoroscopy. So what happened next? Well, she was referred to psychiatry and psychology. Nobody was really clear why she was referred to psychology and psychiatry, except that the speech and language therapist said so. I suppose what was helpful in this case is that the psychiatrist and the psychologist in question knew this woman, and she knew them, not necessarily as professionals, but just as people that she'd come into contact with throughout her life and services, and she was happy to accept visits and have chats. She was resolutely clear about her stated will and preference, and had no difficulties talking about she was no problem taking a risk of maintaining her preferred food choices, because her food was really important to her. She loved her meals, especially in her new setting in the cottage. She completely accepted the fact that there was a small possibility that she could aspirate. She didn't want to have any assessment to determine if this was the case, and she accepted that she could have a recurrence of pneumonia. She actually went further than that and started talking about her thinking ahead wishes. She said she never wanted to go back to hospital again. She said that her wish was to remain in the cottage with the staff that she loved, and that if anything ever happened to her again, that we were to respect that. And it turned out to be a really helpful conversation, because 2 years later, she experienced a fairly catastrophic stroke. The ambulance staff arrived. She absolutely, resolutely refused to get into that ambulance. She was able to express her decision to stay in the cottage, and she had her end-of-life care attended to her by familiar staff, people who really loved and cared about her, but with the support of the local palliative care team. And all of this was supported by her family, and the decision was upheld. Okay, sorry, I have another one. Intersectionality and positive risk-taking. As I said, the service where I work was previously known as the Sisters of Charity of Jesus and Mary Services. We're now the Marisa Foundation. But needless to say, the rights of people around expressing their sexuality has always been an issue. And in this particular instance, we were supporting a young autistic man who has a co-occurring moderate level of intellectual disability and a diagnosis of fetal alcohol syndrome. He had grown up in foster care and had left the care system at the age of 18. He then came into disability services and was living in his own apartment in a community setting with staff supervision. This man was really keen to express his identity as an autistic gay man and to socialise in gay bars and attend gay pride. People didn't really know what to do with this. He was living in rural Ireland. They felt like there was a possibility that he was at risk from other people in the community. An assessment of his sexual knowledge and his understanding of the consent laws was undertaken. He really didn't understand. He knew what he wanted to do, but he wasn't sure about the steps to take. He had a really open-minded and supportive staff team who have been working with him to help him understand the concepts of consent. But this year, with successful, it wasn't called risk enablement or positive risk taking, but his staff team built a plan and negotiated with him how he could safely visit gay bars and celebrate gay pride. And his right to socialise in ordinary community settings was upheld. And he continues to enjoy this. Might seem very simple, but it requires a level of empowerment. And the final case that I'll just talk about a little bit might be one that some of the really murky water, the bog snorkeling stuff, can be around issues of self-neglect. I don't know if, I'm sure all of you are familiar with these type of situations. This particular situation is an autistic woman who's living in independent accommodation. She's access to outreach supports from disability services because she was discharged from the mental health services for being a non-attender or a service refuser. Again, she'd gathered a number of diagnoses along the way. including a mild level of intellectual disability and possible personality disorder, but that's questionable. There's no doubt that she had a history of trauma. She didn't trust anybody, possibly with very good reason. She made consistent crisis calls to emergency services, but she resolutely declined support with the basic care of things like personal hygiene, medical interventions, mental health supports, and she didn't let anybody into her apartment. She had very few natural supports because when she was discharged from mental health services, she was shipped over to disability services in a different area, different county, where she didn't know anybody. In the last year, this woman sustained a fairly typical household accident where she caught her finger in a door and ended up with a wound in her hand. Now, what you would typically do is clean the wound, seek, first aid. If it wasn't getting better, you might seek medical attention. This woman wasn't having any of it. She wrapped it in a tissue and left the tissue in place over 2 weeks. The disability outreach worker attempted to engage with her around this, but she refused to speak to her. But she would communicate by letter. So the disability outreach worker informed her of the risk of infection or potential systemic infection or even sepsis, because these were the really kind of scary things that people were talking about. And she responded in writing that she understood that these were possibilities, but she had no intentions of seeking medical attention or even advice. So a team meeting was convened. First aid items were purchased and they were left outside the door of the apartment with instructions of what might be helpful. In the meantime, the woman travelled around the community showing people her bloody finger with the dirty tissue wrapped around it, and consternation ensued. So the safeguarding team were notified, the Gardaí were notified. So the Gardaí arrived at her door to do a welfare check, and I think she very clearly told the Gardaí where to go. So she was deemed to have capacity to make an unwise decision, but guess what? The wound spontaneously healed, she didn't get an infection, everything was grand. So where to from here? And I'm going to finish up just after this. Just to talk about that the research has shown characteristics for what are risk-enabling approaches. I sometimes think the word risk in itself scares people. Certainly within our own services, the minute we talk about risk, people go, oh, like better not do, there's something to be worried about here. It's not a great word when we're talking about giving people a good life. But what the literature suggests is that in order to have really effective and proactive and empowering teams that enable people to live good lives, we need trust at every level, from a top-down level, a bottom-up level. So the people that we support need to trust us, we need to trust them, leaders need to trust teams, CEOs need to trust teams and leaders, we need cooperation. We need to let go, because a lot of the time it's the risk to ourselves that we're worried about. It's not the risk to the person. We need a high level of creativity. We need to build bonds and bridges, because a lot of the people that refuse services or decline our services do so for a very good reason. May not have been helpful in the past, may have been abusive in the past. Nothing is benign. We need to be prepared to take a leap of faith, while at the same time to have really high expectations for ourselves and of services. We need to be happy to let luck take a part, because do you know what? The world is uncertain and unpredictable, and we need a level of flexibility. In terms of practical approaches, like after today, how do we embed this type of culture change within services? Like I hope people will come up with some ideas, but you'd wonder, like, is there a role for local and national focus on capturing real human stories that demonstrate the magic of risk enablement? Because we're very quick to publish HICWA reports talking about non-compliance. We don't share the good stuff. We don't share the magic moments. We don't share the good news stories. And like, we should really be co-producing this with the people we support. We need a primary investment in relational approaches. None of us come into this work to be paper pushers. Risk enablement happens in the context of authentic and meaningful relationships. That's where we need to invest our time. I wonder about the use of self-audit. and reflective practice. Because we're constantly in that red zone of stress, and that shuts down creativity and reflection. I wonder about the use of audiovisual case studies and national websites to share good news stories, co-produced with the people that we support. One thing we certainly need to do as professionals is to adopt a sense of professional humility. We're not all that. Oftentimes we do harm. We just don't think of it like that because we're well-intentioned. So we need to adopt a stance of open curiosity, respectful uncertainty. We're not all experts. We can't predict the future. Humility and compassion. But that doesn't mean we just do nothing and let bad things happen to people. We have to be really proactive in working with people who are challenging to engage, but we need to figure out why they're challenging to engage. There's usually a really good reason, and where support is declined. We need to invest in developing competencies around interdisciplinary collaborative practice, because it just doesn't happen naturally. And we really need to promote supported decision-making and risk enablement. So just to conclude, there's two really nice quotes from a book called Social Work, Cats and Rocket Science, which if you're working in the area of disability, I'd really recommend. There's some magnificent case studies in there that are very emotive. And it's kind of a call to activism, you know, for us professionals to get back into the role of being kind of, you know, revolutionaries again. And they talk about before you can safeguard people's rights, first you have to safeguard the right to have rights and to have rights on an equal basis with all other human beings. So it starts with citizenship. They also say, if you can't see the person behind the decision you're presented with, well then you need to stop and properly reflect. If you think the key decision you're involved in making is allocation of funding or bestowing of a service via a care plan, well then you're just focused on buying stuff. The key decisions are which values you're going to uphold and which approach will underpin your practice, and whether these will uphold the person's dignity and autonomy. Positive risk-taking, risk enablement, it's a robust and evidence-based approach for improving outcomes. It constitutes best practice in terms of promoting autonomy. It encourages a focus on capacity building. And it facilitates a focus on creativity and a move away from risk-averse cultures. Fundamentally, positive risk-taking enriches the lives of the people that we support. And even more important at the moment, it provides hope for a better future. So, thank you.